Okay, let's discuss the Ranstrom essay. Paul's inclusion of the Gentiles as an opening for non-Christian traditions. So Ranstrom, the world in front, he's a teaching fellow in the Department of Theology at Boston College. So he is a professor in the Bible. So let's look at his thesis. It's certainly worthwhile, even necessary, to consider whether the Bible itself has a global perspective. In our own time, the rise in popularity and increased legitimacy given to interreligious dialogue is pressuring Christians to relax and even eliminate claims of revealed truth. After all, as some have argued, hasn't the pretension to be a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a people set apart, led to exclusivism, chauvinism, and expansionism? So isn't this perspective of being chosen and having the exclusive truth, right, is that something that is detrimental, right? So the question about whether or not that's actually something that is godly or that is Christ-like, right, an important question to ask. Christians, however, he says, should not renounce their faith or their belief in the truth of the biblical tradition in light of this challenge. The New Testament itself was written in pressure situations where inside and outsider debates generated interethnic and interreligious conflict and debate. I believe, and here it is, that Paul's letter to the Romans has something to say to this contemporary global sensitivity. So there's a way, he says, in which Paul's letter to the Romans speaks specifically to inclusivism and pluralism, right? In the context of how to retain your idea of Christianity having truth and it not needing to be an exclusive perspective or an exclusivist perspective. Unlike other correspondences he had with churches throughout Asia Minor, so he's giving us a little context into the world behind, Paul had never been to Rome and had no relationship with Roman Christians. He was reaching out to them primarily because he needed to rally support for his missionary expedition to Spain. So he needed them. He needed their support. The Gentile Christian community was most likely disparaging the venerable Jewish tradition, perhaps following an interpretation of Paul's legitimation of the Gentile mission and Gentile Christian identity in Galatians. The Jewish Christian community, indignant at being dishonored by the traditional dishonorable Gentiles, responded with condescension by relying on stereotypes of the nations and their immorality, right? So this is what we're finding in Romans 1. It's really important here then to think about the way in which Ranstrom himself is trying to read into the context to understand what Paul was writing about and why he would have been writing this. We can imagine Paul's situation very much like our own interrelated and interreligious world, where our words and actions are never allowed the privacy of their limited audience, but get caught up in different, more strained contexts, right? Which is where we are right now, reading these kind of texts in new contexts that Paul never, when he originally wrote it, intended to read his letters, right? He didn't intend people 2,000 years later to be reading this and trying to interpret it in their own context and much less apply it to their own context. Paul begins Romans with a plight narrative in 1:18 through 32, which we read previously. It describes the Gentiles and their situation before God. God's grace and truth was indeed given to the Gentiles, but was rejected. The Gentiles relied on their lower nature rather than on God's truth. And Paul introduces a laundry list of vices that ensued, which we discussed, or which would have been seen as disgusting, right? Wickedness, envy, evil, greed, malice, disorder, all these things that the Gentiles were given over to. Now, a first century Jewish Christian audience reading this opening to Romans would have nodded their heads in approval, like, yeah, get them, Paul, get them. They're disgusting. We can't stand them. They're impure, right? What Paul narrates in 1:18 through 32 would have been a very familiar Jewish invective against the Gentiles. So this would have been what Jews thought and said about the Gentiles often. And it would have been viewed as unequivocal victory for their claims to superiority over the Gentiles. We're chosen by God. We're the best ones. The Gentiles are not. Finally, Paul had taken their side and the Gentile Christians are put in their place. Yet, this is where Paul surprises them. For in the very next chapter, Paul accuses the Jews of failing to uphold the law and deluding themselves, that they would escape God's judgment, that they wouldn't have to experience the same repercussions for what they are guilty of. As Paul says, There is no distinction. All have sinned and are deprived of the glory of God. We can learn from this truth, for often Christians compare religious traditions unfavorably, right? That they don't get it, but we do. And there's often then these lopsided comparisons and contrasts, right? When you look at certain teachings or certain practices of other people, right? They do this. I'm thinking now of Islamophobia, right? They do this. Their women are oppressed, right? It's easy to do that to other religions when we feel that we have the corner on the truth. But it's crucial to note that Paul in Romans doesn't stop with a universal condemnation. Condemnation in Romans serves only to undercut claims of superiority that were causing conflict and division within the community, right? Again, with the Jews thinking that they were better than the Gentiles. And Paul is trying to get them to operate together in one community, seeing themselves as equal. It also sets the stage for the insight in the very next line that Jewish and Gentile Christians both are, quote, justified freely by his grace through the redemption in Christ Jesus. Just as Gentile Christians and Jewish Christians are impartially judged, they're also impartially redeemed in Christ. They're all in the same boat. There are no exceptions in either judgment or salvation. But I would argue there needs to be a place for members of non-Christian religious traditions within God's plan. Anything less is too parochial, right? That there's got to be a way that all people can know God. What he's saying is there's no way that God would only choose some people. Right now I'm thinking with Phelps Roper, who believed, yes, only certain people are chosen by God. Get over it and deal with it. What Ranstrom is saying is that's impossible, right? That's not what he doesn't believe. That's the character of God. Now, Paul didn't have this question in mind in the first century, but today we can bring the revelatory text of Romans into conversation with contemporary questions to address this concern. Let's discuss Paul's treatment of Abraham. And here's where he goes into this more difficult argument. In Romans 4, Paul had to answer the question, who is in the community of salvation? Only the Jews? Only the Gentile Christians? Paul mediates his conflict by hearkening back to the prototypical figure of Abraham. Abraham is the ancestor of God's community of salvation, which includes, as we know now, right? We've talked about this. We talked about it so many times at the beginning of the semester, which includes Jews, Christians, and Gentiles, right? Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Pardon me. Abraham is the ancestor of God's community of salvation. Everyone in this community is somehow related to Abraham. Again, Muslims, Jews, Christians all see Abraham as the forefather of their faith tradition. What aspect of Abraham's existence was deemed by God to be constitutive of the community of salvation? Is it available to all or to some? Paul maintained that what made Abraham righteous in the sight of God was Abraham's faith, so that whoever has faith shares in the same righteousness now consummated in Christ. Paul's theology here was liberating for the Christian community at Rome because faith is not something exhaustively tied to a particular ethnic identity, right? Remember that being a Jew was seen as an ethnic identity. Being a Gentile was seen as an ethnic identity. Rather, it is human invariant. Faith is something that all people have. Therefore, Jew and Gentile are both kin in this community of faith. Abraham is often referred to today as the father of the Jews, Christians, and Muslims. This is in many ways quintessentially Pauline. Through Abraham, all three of these faith traditions are united, right? Going back to the very beginning. Different manifestations, right? Different stories, different narratives, different families, same root. This can be extended beyond even the three Abrahamic faiths, Ranstrom would say, into other faith traditions and people of goodwill, keeping in mind the 20th century Catholic Christian German theologian Karl Rahner, who spoke of the presence of the theological virtue of faith among non-Christian religious traditions and all people of goodwill, right? Goodwill or God's will within. This faith is a mysterious reality, perhaps known fully only to God, but like Paul, Christians place their trust in the impartiality of God's favor and salvation and bring healing and communion to a world torn by interreligious indifference, suspicion, and hostility. Again, so thinking then, rather than exclusively, more expansively, right? Thinking about the way in which, and this is Ranstrom's argument, right? God's love and God's desire is for the inclusion of all, right? Something for you to think about and to consider.